She had slept behind a laundromat for 11 months. She had learned which motel doors locked at midnight. She had learned to disappear inside a coat 2 sizes too big. She had learned to keep her hands still and her eyes on the pavement. Everyone standing in that parking lot had already decided what she was before she said one word, a woman not worth stopping for. 40 feet away, blood spread dark across the asphalt from a man built like a wall, leather-wrapped forearms inked shoulder to knuckle, a beard soaked and dripping, a body no stranger in her right mind would kneel beside. She knelt anyway. What she carried in that coat pocket would take 6 months and 200 engines to come looking for her again. The wind off Lake Superior had teeth in it by the 3rd week of September, and Loretta Shaw had learned to read it the way she used to read a monitor. The drop in temperature after 10, the particular smell of rain that never quite fell, the way the gulls went quiet before a front rolled in off the water. She kept to the alley behind the Norlite Coin Laundry on Piedmont Avenue, where the dryer exhaust vented warm air against the brick, and where the owner, a tired man named Gregors, who never asked her name, left the backlight burning through the night without ever saying why. She was 54 years old. She had a canvas coat that had once belonged to a man twice her size, 2 blankets rolled into a duffel, a plastic bag of things that still mattered, a photograph with the corners gone soft, a Zippo lighter that no longer held flame, a laminated card from a hospital that had not employed her in 3 years, and a small tin box of sewing supplies she had lifted from a donation bin outside a church on Grand Avenue because the zipper on her coat had finally given out and she was tired of the cold finding the gap. She did not think of herself as homeless, the way the word got used on the news, all statistics and shame. She thought of herself as a woman between things, though the between had gone on long enough now that she'd stopped promising herself it would end by winter. Something had happened to her once, a life before this one, though she had gotten skilled at keeping the shape of it folded small, the way she folded the 2 blankets in her duffel each morning so they took up less room than they had any right to. She did not let herself think about the version of her that had worn a uniform, or the version after that, in a place with a different climate and a different kind of noise. Thinking about either one too long was how a person lost the thread of the present entirely, and the present, cold as it was the only thing she could actually stand inside of. She had been patient for 11 months. She had learned that patience, more than courage, was the thing that kept a person alive out here. The commotion started a little after 11 o'clock, out past the laundromat's dumpster, in the gravel lot of the Aurora Rest Motor Inn next door. The kind of highway motel that rented rooms by the week to men who didn't want to explain themselves to a Marriott clerk. Loretta heard the engine first, a single motorcycle running rough, then cutting out too fast, the way an engine dies when the rider isn't easing the throttle so much as losing his grip on it. Then a heavy sound, metal and gravel, and a man's body all arriving at the ground within the same half-second. She stayed in the shadow of the dumpster for the length of 4 breaths, old instinct telling her to stay small, stay unseen, let someone else handle it. Then she heard him try to get up and fail, and swear under his breath in a voice gone thin with shock, and the old instinct lost. He was on one knee in the gravel when she came around the corner, one hand clamped over his other forearm, and even in the weak orange wash of the motel sign she could see it was bad. Blood coming between his fingers in a rhythm that told her an artery hadn't been cut, but a vein or a deep vessel certainly had, welling rather than spraying, but plenty enough to kill a man slowly if nobody stopped it. He was enormous, wrapped in ink from his collarbones to his knuckles, a beard dark and heavy with sweat, a leather vest with patches she didn't recognize thrown over the seat of the downed bike beside him. He looked up at her with the particular fury of a strong man discovering, for the first time in years, that his body had a limit. "Get away from me," he said. "You're going to bleed out in a gravel parking lot in Duluth, Minnesota, over something that needs 11 stitches. Maybe 12, Loretta said, already crouching, already reaching for his wrist to check the pulse below the wound, the way her hands still remembered how to do without asking her permission. Or you can let me look at it. Lady, I don't know you. No, she agreed. You don't. She peeled his fingers back from the gash, a long, ugly laceration along the inside of his forearm, deep enough that she could see the pale gleam of tendon at one edge, the kind of wound that came from a blade, not a fall. Whoever had cut him hadn't been trying to scare him. But you're not going to a hospital tonight, are you? I can see that on your face before you say it. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Then you're going to need somebody who knows what they're doing, she said. And tonight, out here, that's me. He studied her. The coat 2 sizes too big. The smell of the alley still on her. The dirt under her nails. The way her hands, despite everything, were not shaking at all. You a nurse or something? Loretta Shaw looked down at the wound instead of at him, because it was easier, and because some truths came out sideways or not at all. I used to be, she said. Get up. We need light, and we need it now. His name she would learn inside the next 10 minutes, sitting on the edge of a motel bed with a lamp pulled close and a stolen sewing kit open on the nightstand between them, was Gideon Marsh. He did not offer it easily, and she did not ask twice. The tin sewing kit had come from the same church donation bin as her coat, 6 spools of thread in different weights, a paper of needles gone slightly rusted at the points, a stub of white chalk. It was not a suture kit. It was not close to one, but Loretta had learned long before Kandahar that the difference between what you needed and what you had was a gap a trained pair of hands could close if the alternative was worse. This is going to hurt more than it should, she told him, holding the strongest needle over the lamp's flame until the metal glowed. Because I don't have anything to numb it with, and because the thread's not sterile the way I'd want it. So I'm going to run it through rubbing alcohol first and pray. You have rubbing alcohol? In the bag. Bathroom. He didn't move. Then get it, unless you want me using motel mouthwash. He got it. That, she would think later, was the first small thing. Not that he trusted her, because he plainly didn't, but that some old-fashioned deference in him, some part of a man who'd been raised by somebody to respect competence when he saw it, made him do as she said without further argument. He limped to the bathroom and back, favoring the arm, and set the bottle down harder than he needed to, the closest thing to an apology his pride would allow. She worked in silence for the first several minutes, the room lit only by the bedside lamp and the blue wash of the motel's sign through the curtain gap. And Gideon Marsh watched her hands instead of the wound, the way frightened men often did, fixing on the competence in front of them rather than the damage inside themselves. "Who did this to you?" she asked, not because she needed the answer, but because talking kept a patient's blood pressure from spiking and because some habits from a trauma bay never fully left a person. Doesn't matter. It matters to the wound. A knife's a knife, but I want to know if I'm looking for anything left behind. She probed gently at the edges, found nothing, and kept sewing, small even stitches, the kind that came back to her fingers like a language she'd never actually forgotten, only stopped speaking out loud. Talk or don't. Your arm, not my business. He talked eventually in the clipped, reluctant way of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself to anyone. 2 hours earlier, outside a roadhouse 40 minutes south on Highway 61, 3 men from a club called the Cutlass Riders had cornered him over a debt that belonged, technically, to somebody else, a prospect who disappeared owing them $4,000 and had apparently used Gideon's club, the Wraithbound, as collateral in a conversation nobody on Gideon's side had agreed to. A knife had come out. Gideon had gotten away, but not clean, and not fast enough to think through what came next before his bike laid itself down in a motel parking lot on the wrong side of the freeway. "And a hospital's out," Loretta said, half a question. "I got a parole violation waiting on me if I show up anywhere with a police report attached to my name. Assault charge from 4 years back, mostly bogus, but the judge didn't see it that way. I finish my supervision in March. I show up at an ER with a knife wound tonight, some doctor calls it in like they're required to, and March turns into 3 more years. He said this flatly, a fact he'd made peace with the way men make peace with weather. She tied off the last suture, 11 of them evenly spaced, closing the wound with the tidy, deliberate stitching of someone who had once been trusted to do this in far worse light with far less time. She wrapped it, checked the pulse below the bandage, checked the color of his fingertips, and only then let herself sit back. "You need antibiotics," she said. "Not want, need. That cut was dirty and it was made with something that's been God knows where. And if you don't get ahead of an infection, it will not care about your parole. I'll get some." From where? He didn't answer that either, and she was still turning the silence over in her mind when the door opened without a knock, and 2 more men came into the room, filling it the way large men fill small spaces, one of them older, grey-bearded, wearing the same patches she'd glimpsed on Gideon's vest, moving with the unhurried authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Marsh," the older man said, "you look like hell." Then his eyes found Loretta, and something in his face shut like a door. "Who's this?" "She's the reason I'm not still bleeding on the gravel, Emmett." Emmett Larkin looked at her the way she had been looked at for 11 months, coat too big, hair unwashed, hands that had just been elbow-deep in his vice president's arm, and drew the conclusion that a lot of people drew quickly and without apparent effort. "She's strung out? She see anything she shouldn't have?" "Emmett, I'm asking a fair question." Larkin crossed the room, pulled a fold of bills from his jacket without ceremony, and held it toward Loretta, the way a man might toss a scrap to a dog he didn't want circling his porch. "This buys you a room somewhere else tonight, and a memory that's real short. We appreciate the help. We don't need you around after it." Loretta looked at the money for exactly as long as it took to decide something about herself that she hadn't fully decided in 11 months of looking away from things. Then she looked past it, at Larkin, at the particular tiredness in his eyes that told her he'd buried men before and didn't want to bury another one over a debt that wasn't even his club's to begin with. "Keep your money," she said. "But if that wound spikes a fever in the next 48 hours, and it might, you're going to need somebody who can tell the difference between a man who's tough and a man who's septic, because those 2 things look almost identical right up until they don't." "I'm not going anywhere yet." The younger man who'd come in with Larkin, thick-necked, younger than Gideon by a decade, a prospect's plain leather vest still unadorned by the patches the others wore, snorted from the doorway. "She's serious." "Dead serious," Loretta said, and did not raise her voice, and did not look away from Emmett Larkin's eyes, and something in the room shifted half a degree, though none of the 3 men would have admitted it if asked. Emmett Larkin did not apologize, and did not soften, but he did put the folded bills back in his jacket, which for a man like him amounted to the same thing. He told the younger prospect, whose name turned out to be Reggie Voss, to bring the woman a cot from the supply room behind the motel office, and to make sure nobody bothered her, and then he left without another word, the door falling shut behind him hard enough to rattle the window glass. The motel's night clerk, a heavy-set woman named Patty Dunmore, who had worked the Aurora Rest's overnight desk for 11 years and had seen every version of trouble the highway could produce, struck her own bargain with Loretta 2 mornings later. Patty needed rooms cleaned and didn't especially care where the woman doing the cleaning slept the rest of the day, so long as she was gone from view by check-in time and didn't frighten the paying guests. It wasn't a job so much as an arrangement, but it came with a cot in the linen closet, a working shower down the hall, and, more valuable to Loretta than either, a reason to still be at the Aurora Rest when Gideon Marsh's fever came. It came on the 3rd night, a little after 2 in the morning, the way infections do when a body has spent all its reserves pretending everything is fine. Loretta heard him before she saw him, A low, disoriented muttering through the thin motel wall, furniture scraping, a man arguing with someone who wasn't there. She let herself into room 114 with the master key Patty had given her for cleaning, and found Gideon Marsh soaked through his shirt, the skin around his bandage gone an angry, swollen red, streaked upward toward his elbow in thin red lines that told her, before she even touched him, exactly how much time they didn't have. "Cellulitis, moving fast," she said aloud, mostly to herself, unwrapping the dressing with hands that had gone steady again the moment they had something urgent to do. The wound underneath had gone from clean-edged to weeping, and the smell told her as much as the color did. You should be in a hospital right now, not should, need, tonight. "No," Gideon said, thick-tongued with fever, and even sick he had enough of himself left to mean it. "You'll lose the arm before you lose your parole if this gets into your blood. No hospital." He grabbed her wrist, not hard, more like a drowning man grabbing for anything solid. "Please." It was the please that undid her, more than the fever or the streaking red lines, because in 3 years of asking strangers for change on a Duluth sidewalk, she had learned exactly what that word cost a person, and she understood, in a way words couldn't have explained to her, that whatever waited for Gideon Marsh on the other side of a police report was a fear as real as his infection. She spent the next 4 hours doing what she could with what she had, irrigating the wound with saline she begged from Patty's first aid kit, packing it clean, forcing fluids into him, checking his temperature against a plastic strip thermometer bought from a gas station with money she didn't have to spare, watching the clock the way she used to watch a monitor, learning the particular rhythm of a body, deciding whether to fight or fail. Somewhere around 4:30, with his fever finally breaking sweat and his pulse settling under her fingers, she allowed herself to sit down on the floor with her back against the bed frame and put her head in her hands. And that was when the shaking finally came, 3 days late and all at once. It would have been easy that night to walk 2 blocks to the Speedway station and buy something that would make the shaking stop the way it always used to. She thought about it with a clarity that frightened her more than the fever had, thought about the exact configuration of pills that would let her sleep past the fear, thought about how nobody in that motel would blame her, how nobody would even notice, how she had already given more of herself to a stranger's forearm than she had given to anything in 3 years. She sat on that floor for a long time, turning the thought over, and what stopped her in the end was not virtue and was not strength, not exactly. It was Gideon Marsh's breathing, evening out above her in the dark, proof that something she had done with her own 2 hands tonight had worked. She had not felt that particular proof in a very long time, and she was not ready to trade it for anything, not even for quiet. By morning, the red streaking had begun to recede, and Gideon Marsh, grey and hollowed but lucid, looked at her from the bed with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not suspicion, not gratitude exactly. Something closer to a man recalculating a sum he thought he already knew the answer to. "You did that," he said. "All night, for me." "I've done it for worse men in worse rooms," Loretta said, which was true, and which was the first true thing about her own history she had said out loud to anyone in 3 years. "Where?" She almost told him. She got as far as opening her mouth around the shape of a country's name, a base camp's name, and then old habit closed back over it like water over a stone, and she shook her head instead. "Not tonight. You need to eat something that isn't crackers, and I need to go clean 6 rooms before Patty starts asking where I've been." But something had cracked open between them that would not fully close again, and later that same afternoon, when a black pickup truck with Cutlass Riders colors taped crudely across its tailgate rolled slow through the Aurora Rests parking lot, idling long enough to be a threat and not quite long enough to be an attack, it was Loretta who noticed it first from the linen closet window, and Loretta who walked straight to room 114 to warn him, without stopping to weigh whether that made her a woman who had decided finally to stop being invisible. By 9:14 p.m., on a Wednesday in early October, The Aurora Rest's parking lot held 11 motorcycles, 3 pickup trucks, and more men than the Little Highway Motel had probably seen at one time since it opened. Emmett Larkin had called in every Wraithbound member within an hour's ride the moment Loretta's warning reached him, and the Cutlass Riders, 6 of them this time, had rolled in 20 minutes later with the particular slow menace of men who wanted to be seen arriving. Patty Dunmore had locked the office door and killed the exterior lights, which did nothing to stop what was coming and everything to signal that she, at least, had seen this kind of night before and knew enough to get out of its way. Loretta stood at the edge of it, in the shadow between the ice machine and the stairwell, close enough to see and far enough, she told herself, to not be mistaken for anyone's business. Gideon stood near the front of the Wraithbound line, despite the bandage still wrapped thick around his forearm, and it was clear from the set of his shoulders that whatever fear had made him beg her not to call a hospital 3 nights earlier had been folded away somewhere he wasn't going to let anyone see it now. The man who got out of the lead truck on the Cutlass side was older than the others, grey at the temples, a scar through one eyebrow that had healed badly, and Loretta recognized the particular stillness in him immediately. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how far he was willing to go to save face in front of 5 younger men who were watching him for the answer. "You owe us $4,000, Marsh," the man said. "Or you owe us the boy who took it, one or the other tonight." "The boy's not mine to give you," Gideon said. "The debt's not mine to pay. You already took a piece out of my arm for a mistake that isn't ours." It might have ended in exactly the kind of violence that everyone in that parking lot had been raised, one way or another, to expect if a 19-year-old on the Cutlass side, a thin kid named Denny, who Loretta would later learn had been riding with them only 4 months, hadn't stepped forward with a tire iron half raised and caught his own boot wrong on a pothole in the dark, going down hard, the iron bar coming down across his own shin with a crack audible even over the idling engines. The whole lot froze for the length of one breath, both sides recalibrating, unsure whether the boy going down changed anything or nothing at all. Loretta didn't wait to find out which. She was across the gravel and on her knees beside Denny before either club had fully decided what his fall meant. Cutting his jeans open with a folding knife, someone had pressed into her hand without either of them agreeing to it, finding the open fracture beneath, bone not quite through skin, but close, the kind of injury that could go bad in an hour if nobody splinted it correctly. "I need something rigid, 2 feet and a belt," she said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, and it was Emmett Larkin, of all people, who peeled his own belt free and knelt down across from her without being asked, holding the boy's legs steady while she worked, the 2 of them president of one club and no one at all, cooperating in the mud and gravel like the war between their patches, had gone quiet for exactly as long as this took. "You're the one who fixed Marsh's arm," the grey-templed Cutlass man said, standing over her now, and there was something different in his voice than there had been 30 seconds earlier. "I'm the one who's going to keep this kid's leg from turning into something a surgeon has to rebuild with pins, if everybody stops posturing long enough to let me finish," Loretta said, not looking up, splinting the fracture with the flat length of a tire iron. Someone else surrendered without comment, wrapping it tight with Emmett's belt. "He needs an ambulance, a real one. Now, not in 10 minutes, when whatever you're all about to do to each other is finished." It was, in the end, the simplest thing in the world that broke the standoff. Not a threat, not a show of strength, but a 54-year-old woman in a coat 2 sizes too big, kneeling in gravel between 2 clubs that hated each other, doing the only thing in that parking lot that mattered more for one suspended minute than the $4,000 or the knife wound or 20 years of bad blood on Highway 61. The grey-templed man called the ambulance himself, gave his own name to the dispatcher without flinching, and when it arrived, 12 minutes later, sirens washing red and white across both lines of motorcycles, Nobody on either side made a move to leave before the boy was loaded in and gone. "We're square," the man told Gideon afterward, low enough that only a few heard it. "The debt dies with the boy who ran off with it. Nobody's collecting from you for another man's theft. Not after tonight." Gideon didn't answer right away. He was looking at Loretta instead, at the blood on her hands that wasn't his this time, at the calm that had come over her the instant a body needed saving, a calm that had nothing to do with medication or motels or 11 months of sleeping behind a laundromat. "Who taught you to do that?" he said, "under fire like that without even blinking?" "Somebody did a long time ago, in a place a lot louder than this parking lot," Loretta said, and this time finally she let the sentence finish instead of folding it back down small. "I'll tell you the rest of it. Just not standing in the gravel." She told him 2 nights later, sitting on the concrete step outside the motel's laundry room with 2 cups of gas station coffee going cold between them. She told him about Kandahar, about the plywood surgical unit and the sound helicopters made at 3 in the morning when they were bringing back more wounded than the unit was built to hold, about being 49 years old and the only nurse in her guard unit who'd already spent 2 decades in emergency rooms before anyone handed her a rank. She told him about the back injury 2 years after she came home, the boy in the Duluth ER who'd been stronger than any patient had a right to be, the prescription that helped and then didn't and then became the only thing that did. She told him about the 2 documentation errors, about the state board's letter, about her son Caleb, 26 now, and living in Ohio, who had stopped answering her calls after the 3rd time she'd lied to him about why she needed money, and who did not yet know that his mother had spent the better part of a year sleeping behind a coin laundry on Piedmont Avenue. "You could still call him," Gideon said. "I could. I'm not ready for what he'll hear in my voice." She wrapped both hands around the paper cup. "I will be. Not yet." Gideon Marsh, it turned out, understood something about not being ready, about debts a person owed themselves before they owed anyone else. And he didn't push her, which she would remember later as one of the more generous things anyone had done for her in 3 years. What Emmett Larkin did over the following weeks was less generous in appearance and more generous in fact. He didn't apologize for the folded bills he'd once tried to hand her. Men like Emmett rarely apologized in words. But he started showing up at the Aurora Rest on Tuesday afternoons with a thermos of real coffee, and eventually with a name and a phone number for a nurse practitioner he knew from his own wife's dialysis clinic across town, a woman named Yolanda Price, who ran a sliding-scale clinic out of a converted storefront on West Superior Street, and who, as it happened, was always looking for capable hands, licensed or not yet relicensed, willing to do the unglamorous work of triage and wound care for patients nobody else wanted to see. It took Loretta 4 months to get her Minnesota nursing license reinstated, 4 months of hearings and paperwork and a probationary period that required more patience than the 11 she'd already spent sleeping in a linen closet, 4 months during which she worked unofficially at Dr. Price's clinic under a volunteer designation, 4 months during which Gideon Marsh's arm healed into a long silver scar he would carry the rest of his life and never once complain about, and during which the Wraithbound Motorcycle Club, without any single person deciding it out loud, began treating the woman who had saved their vice president's arm and a Cutlass rider's leg in the same gravel lot as something closer to family than to a stranger who happened to be useful. She moved out of the linen closet in November into a small apartment above a hardware store on London Road that Emmett Larkin's wife, who ran a property management office on the side, happened to have sitting empty. Loretta insisted on paying rent from her first real paycheck, and Emmett let her because he understood better than most that a woman who had spent a year with nothing needed to know that what she had now was actually hers. By spring, when her license came back in full, she gave notice at Dr. Price's clinic in one sense and never really left it in another. 3 days a week for the sliding scale storefront, 2 days a week for a home health agency that paid better and let her put money aside, for the first time in years, towards something other than surviving. She called her son Caleb on a Sunday afternoon in April, and the call lasted 40 minutes, and she cried afterward in a way she let herself do, because there was finally a home to do it in. What nobody expected, not Loretta, not Gideon, not even Emmett Larkin, who thought he'd planned for every contingency a motorcycle club could produce, was that the story of the woman who'd stitched a vice president's arm shut with a stolen sewing kit and then splinted a rival's shattered shin with a tire iron, and a belt would travel the way stories travel through people who ride the same highways for a living, chapter by chapter, club by club, state by state, until riders she had never met and would never treat were repeating her name in roadhouses 300 miles from Duluth. 6 months to the week after the night, Gideon Marsh laid his bike down in the Aurora Rests gravel lot on a Saturday morning in late March, with frost still silvering the grass along London Road. Loretta Shaw opened the door of her apartment above the hardware store to find the street below filled, curb to curb, with motorcycles. Nearly 200 of them by the count. Patty Dunmore gave the local paper afterward. Riders from the Wraithbound and from a dozen clubs beyond it. Men and women who had heard the story second-hand and third-hand and had come, some of them from 4 states away, not to ask anything of her, but simply to be the ones who found her, the way she had once found a bleeding stranger in a parking lot and refused to walk past him. Emmett Larkin stood at the front of them on the sidewalk below her window, an old man in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets, and when Loretta came down the stairs in her nurse's scrubs, ready for her Saturday shift at the clinic, he was the one who spoke first, in front of nearly 200 people who had gone quiet to hear him. 6 months ago, I looked at this woman, and I saw exactly what I expected to see, and I was wrong about every part of it, he said. You don't get to know what a person's carrying by looking at what they're wearing when you find them. Some of the steadiest hands you'll ever meet are attached to somebody the rest of the world already stopped looking at. Nobody cheered exactly. It wasn't that kind of morning. But Gideon Marsh, standing near the front with the long silver scar on his forearm hidden beneath his jacket sleeve, allowed himself something close to a smile, and Loretta Shaw, who had spent 11 months teaching herself not to be seen, stood in the cold on London Road and let 200 strangers see her anyway. The gathering broke apart within the hour, the way these things do, engines turning over one by one until the street was full of noise and then empty of it, everyone drifting back toward wherever they'd come from. Patty Dunmore, who had driven over from the motel specially to watch it happen, waited until the last bike had cleared the block before she walked up the stairs to Loretta's door, not to make a speech or mark the occasion, just carrying a small paper bag from the hardware store below. Inside, it was a replacement zipper, the exact size, still in its plastic wrapper, for a canvas coat Loretta hadn't worn in months and had no intention of throwing away. "Saw it in your closet last week when I brought the mail up," Patty said, handing it over like it was nothing at all. "Figured a coat like that's worth keeping in good repair. Never know when somebody's going to need it again."